All right, number 2. What did I like about it? What do I think might come up on this year's AP from this type of a question? So this is essentially a question about data collection, right? What we had as our part 1, what the AP curriculum calls Unit 3, which is this idea of we have these big ideas, taking random samples and, sampling bias that could happen. We have the idea of observational studies versus experiments and why it's so important to have random assignment in an experiment. And then we get into a bunch of sort of good critical thinking questions with things like confounding variables and blocking, which is where this question heads. So I really liked this question. Let's break down what exactly we have going on here. So we're looking at a study to compare two different dietary, that's not a highlighter, two different dietary supplements, glucosamine and chondroitin, and we're trying to figure out which one is better at promoting hip and joint health in older dogs. So we are randomly selecting 300 dogs, and they will be given, I guess, these two different treatments. They don't say anything about the random assignment. They haven't gone ahead and explained what they're doing. They just said, we're going to go ahead and do this, and we'll evaluate them after 6 months of taking these dietary supplements. So A asks, what's an advantage of adding a control group? So again, a good just thinking question. It doesn't really require a lot of knowledge of these terms specifically. I mean, you need to know that a control group is a group that gets no treatment. But nice critical thinking question. So if I were writing an answer to this question, I would sit there and say, okay, well, in an experiment, I need at least 2 groups so that I can compare them. So at the end of the day, if I do the experiment sort of how it's started laid out already, I can compare glucosamine and chondroitin. Boom. I can say which one might be better at promoting joint health, especially if I do random assignment. However, I am not going to be able to say that this is relative to, like, what is no treatment. So we need to maybe define what, no treatment is. So a control group of dogs without a dietary supplement. Hold on, I'm going to get that child. Would allow us to see the impacts. And I would probably talk about joint and hip health after 6 months as a comparison. Something like that. If you actually look at the rubric for this question, they really wanted you to just have something to sort of define what a control group was and the purpose, right, to control for outside influences, and then to make sure that you put something about the context, right? So say something about the fact that this will allow us to compare to no treatment, and then make sure that you say no treatment means this whole idea of we're talking about joint health and hip health in dogs. That could do nothing. All right, and so question B is another one I expect to see something similar to. I do expect something where we have to maybe describe the sampling or the assignment process, and we know what this is going to look like, right? We even have a nice little, I think, a set of guidelines that the woman who's stuff I posted up on Google Classroom had a nice little, like, make sure if you're doing this, you randomly assign them numbers and then use a random number generator, or you put names into a hat, blah, blah, blah. That way we are getting our random groups. So names into a hat tends to be a little simpler than, random numbers to a number generator, and then making sure that you assign the numbers back to the people to figure out who's in which group. That can be kind of annoying. And the other thing is we make sure that we say without replacement, right? That we've taken someone's name out of the hat, they're now in that group, or they're now part of our sample, and we do not put them back in the hat to be selected again. So assuming a control group's added, explain how you would assign 300 dogs to these 3 groups using a completely randomized design. So if I were doing this, I would put all the dogs, put the names of the dogs in a hat. If you want to, you could assign them numbers, but again, I'm going to be kind of lazier here just because I realize this will be just as effective with less words. Select 100 without replacement. I guess I should put here thoroughly mix. And then I need to make sure that I say that those are going to be the dogs in a certain group. So these dogs assign to glucosamine. It doesn't matter. Select 100 of the remaining 200 without replacement. And we're going to assign them to chondroitin. And then remaining 100 are our control. So something like that, right? You could also do a random number generator to select your 100 and then assign them, but you need to make sure that you're being clear that those are going to be the dogs given this particular thing at the end. So, and then we need to make sure we say without replacement. So when you look at the rubric for these questions, they are pretty clear. This one specifically had 2 things you had to nail for part B. You had to make sure that there was some randomness, right? That you had that chance element. So mixing them and randomly selecting out of a hat, we've got that. We get the first check of the rubric. If we use a random number generator, we obviously get that check as well. The second part, which is the part where I think things tend to go wrong and where they can be kind of nitpicky, is that it has to be something where if somebody read through your steps, they would be able to reproduce and do the same process. So this is where you might want to use steps. You might want to number what you would have people do. That's a really good place to start. But you also, that's where if you didn't say assign them to this treatment group, the reader is going to have to sit there and say, well, they never actually specified that I needed to give them glucosamine, and so I don't know how that's going to work. Same thing with like the without replacement. If it's not clear, that's where they're going to get you, because they're going to say, well, what was I supposed to do with those, the names in the hat after I pulled them out? So 2 pieces, make sure that you have the randomness coming in with either a random number generator or mixing things in a hat, that's fine. And then 2, it needs to be something where if a complete idiot came through and read your thing, they could make a sample or a random assignment using your little algorithm. All right, so let's move on to part C. Part C asks us about a very specific term that related to experiments, blocking. Blocking was, remember, sort of the experiment's answer to stratification. So if we thought there was something that might have different results, we could block on it. We could take all of our dogs, first separate them into groups based on some characteristic, and then do a random assignment instead of just randomly assigning from the 300 dogs. All right, so without that knowledge, it would be a little bit more challenging, right? But let's look at this. We can either propose on clinics or proposing on the block of, the breed of the dog. So the question becomes, which one are we more concerned might influence our outcome, right? Like which one might change the relationship or what's going on when we apply our treatments to this particular situation. So in this case, glucosamine, chondroitin, nothing. Which do you think is related to hip health and joint health more? The breed of the dog or the actual clinic that they came from? So it says, how would you decide? Obviously, I have an opinion here. I think the breed of dog matters more. Certain dogs are more prone to hip dysplasia and other issues, right? So I'd probably make that argument. But it says, how would you decide which one of these to use? So now we want to talk about something, well, we need to look at which one has this influence more. All right, so if we wanted to decide how we would decide, we would need to analyze. We need to see, sorry, I'm feeding my baby. We need to see which is more closely related to dogs' hip and joint health. Oops. Something like that to determine which to use as a blocking variable, right? Because the whole point of blocking is to reduce those confounding variables, those other things that might influence our outcome. So obviously you could go a lot further with this. You could talk about how, but all you needed to say here was some rationale for how you could choose. So either they wanted to say something about relationship to our outcome that is related to a dog's hip or joint health, or talking about whichever one has like more variation in terms of the hip or the joint health, whether it's between breeds, or there's more variation in breeds, their hip and joint health, or more variation in clinics between dogs' hip and joint health. So those are your two things you're looking for. So I like this. I don't know that they'll get as nitpicky as they did on C with giving you guys the word blocking, but I do think that that's a really easy place for them to go for making you do sort of this critical thinking piece. So I really liked A and C. They used terms that we needed to understand and then had us actually use some critical thinking as to how they might impact stuff. So that was why I chose those. I also think B is a huge possibility in terms of this random assignment, random sampling. That's usually a pretty big chunk of the exam. If you actually look down at the breakdown for the units, I can't remember what the unit breakdown is for 3, but it is pretty high. And so this is an easy way for them to get us that chunky unit 3, and it can happen within any other question, right? They could ask us about the strawberries. They could, right? It's always going to be applicable to talk about control groups, blocking, and then how exactly you could have designed the experiment in such a way.